Undefined car engine died with a sputter, leaving the silence of the small town rushing in to fill the space. Leo sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. Rain pounded against the roof, a constant, rhythmic drumming that matched the nervous thumping in his chest. He stared up at the house in front of him. It wasn't a castle, but it was big enough to look lonely. The paint was peeling in long, gray strips, and the windows stared back like dark, empty eyes. This was supposed to be a fresh start, or at least a way to make some quick cash, but right now, it just looked like a lot of work. He took a deep breath, grabbed his backpack from the passenger seat, and pushed the door open. The cold air hit him instantly, carrying the smell of wet earth and pine needles. His boots sank into the mud as he walked up the overgrown path. The grass was tall, reaching for his knees, and it brushed against his jeans, soaking them through. He felt a twinge of regret. Maybe he should have stayed in the city. Maybe he should have kept his old job, the one that made him want to scream every single morning. But no, he was here now. The lawyer had made it sound so simple. "Just fix it up, sell it, and move on," the man had said with a smile, as if fixing a house this size was as easy as changing a light bulb. Leo reached the front porch and stopped. The wood groaned under his weight, sounding like an old man sighing. He fished the key out of his pocket. It was heavy and brass, cold to the touch. He slid it into the lock. It stuck at first, fighting him, but with a little wiggle and a shove, it turned with a loud asterisk clack. The door swung open and the smell hit him. It wasn't a bad smell exactly. It was just old, like dust and dry wood, and maybe a hint of lavender that had faded years ago. He stepped inside and flipped the light switch by the door. Nothing happened, of course. He pulled his phone out, turned on the flashlight, and swept the beam across the room. The hallway was long and narrow, covered in wallpaper that used to be yellow but was now a cracked, dusty beige. There were mirrors on the walls, their glass spotted with age, reflecting his own tired face back at him a dozen times. To his left was a living room, and to his right, what looked like a dining room. Everything was covered in white sheets. It looked like the furniture was sleeping, or maybe like ghosts were hiding underneath. Leo laughed softly at his own imagination. He wasn't afraid of ghosts. He was afraid of plumbing, wiring, and the bank account that was currently hovering very close to zero. He walked into the living room and pulled the sheet off a sofa. A cloud of dust poofed into the air, making him cough and wave his hand in front of his face. Underneath, the velvet fabric was crushed velvet, deep red and surprisingly intact. He sat down, testing it. A spring poked him in the back, but it held. "Okay," he whispered to the empty room. "We can work with this." He spent the next hour just walking around, opening cupboards and peeking into corners. The kitchen was a disaster. The appliances looked like they were from the 1970s, avocado green and rusty. But the cabinets were solid wood. He could sand those down. In the pantry, he found a few old cans of soup, way past their expiration date, and a stack of newspapers tied with string. He didn't look at them yet. He just wanted to get a feel for the place. By the time he made it upstairs, his stomach was growling loudly. He hadn't eaten since breakfast, and the drive had taken 6 hours. He found the bedroom that must have belonged to his gray tuncle. It was sparse, just a bed, a dresser, and a wooden chair in the corner. But there was a door he hadn't noticed yet, tucked behind the chair. It was small, barely 5 feet tall, like it was made for a child or maybe just for storage. Leo felt a spark of curiosity. He opened the small door. It led to a narrow set of stairs that went up even higher. "An attic," he muttered. "Great, probably full of rats." But he climbed anyway. The steps creaked with every step. At the top, there was no light switch, so he relied on his phone again. The attic was surprisingly clean. There was no insulation hanging down, no piles of junk. There was just one thing in the center of the room, a desk. It was a beautiful roll-top desk made of dark mahogany. It gleamed in the light of his phone as if someone had been polishing it recently. Leo walked up to it slowly. The top was closed. He reached out and touched the wood. It was smooth, warm almost. He rolled the top up. Inside, it was organized perfectly. Pens, ink bottles, a stack of pristine white paper, and in the middle, lying there as if it had been placed just moments ago, was a single black notebook. Leo frowned. He looked around the attic, checking the corners. No rats, no spiders, just the desk. He picked up the notebook. It was heavy, bound in leather. He opened it to the first page. The handwriting was sharp, jagged. If you found this, you're looking for the truth, but be careful, the truth in this house isn't always what it seems. Leo snapped the book shut. His heart was hammering again, but this time it wasn't from the drive. It was a weird mix of excitement and fear. He shoved the notebook into his jacket pocket. He needed fresh air. He needed food. And he needed to talk to someone who wasn't a dead relative's handwriting. He locked the front door back up and headed back to his car. He drove slowly down the narrow, winding road until he saw a neon sign buzzing in the distance. It was a diner. The Griddle. Simple enough. He parked the car and walked inside. The bell above the door jingled. The place was warm and smelled like bacon and coffee. There were only a few people inside. An old couple in the corner, two truckers at the counter, and a young woman wiping down a table. She looked up as he walked in. She had dark hair tied back in a messy bun and an apron that had seen better days. "Just you?" she asked. "Yeah, just me," Leo said, sliding onto a stool at the counter. "Can I get a coffee and a burger, please?" "Sure thing, honey. Fries with that?" "Absolutely." She poured him a cup of coffee without asking, sliding it over to him. "You're the guy who bought the old Miller place, aren't you?" Leo froze with the cup halfway to his lips. He put it down. "Is it that obvious?" "Small town," she said with a shrug, wiping her hands on her apron. "News travels fast. I'm Riley, by the way." "Leo," he said. "Well, Leo, you picked a hell of a day to move in. Storm's supposed to get worse tonight." She leaned against the counter, looking at him with curious eyes. "You fixing it up to sell?" "That's the plan," Leo said. "Quick flip, make some money, get out." Riley smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "That's what they all say. People come in, think they can strip it and flip it, but then they realize the house has character. It likes to keep people." Leo laughed nervously. "It's just a house, Riley." "Wood and bricks." "Maybe," she said. She didn't push it. She turned around to put his order in. Leo sipped his coffee. It was strong, bitter, and exactly what he needed. He pulled the black notebook halfway out of his pocket, just to feel the leather cover, then shoved it back in. He wasn't sure why he didn't tell her about it. It felt like a secret, and for some reason he wanted to keep it that way for a little while longer. When his burger came, he ate it quickly, realizing how hungry he actually was. Riley came back a few times to refill his coffee, chatting about the town. She told him where the nearest hardware store was and which gas station had the best prices. She was nice, normal. It grounded him. "So," she said as he was paying the bill, "if you need any help with the heavy lifting, my brother does odd jobs. Name's Ben. He's at the hardware store usually around 8. "I might take you up on that," Leo said. "Thanks." "Drive safe, Leo," she said, watching him as he walked out. Back in the car, the rain was coming down harder now, turning the world into a smear of gray and black. The drive back to the house felt longer than the drive away. When he pulled into the driveway, the house looked even darker than before. He sat in the car for a minute, looking at the upstairs window, the one that led to the attic. He hadn't turned any lights on, he was sure of it. But there in the window was a faint yellow glow, like a candle. Leo rubbed his eyes. He was tired. His brain was playing tricks on him. He grabbed his flashlight and got out of the car. He marched up to the front door, unlocked it, and stormed inside. He didn't bother being quiet. He ran up the stairs, taking them two at a time. He reached the small door, threw it open, and rushed up to the attic. He stopped. The room was empty, no candle, no light. Just the desk sitting in the middle of the floor, the moonlight streaming through the window and hitting the mahogany wood. Leo walked over to the desk. The roll top was down. He reached out to open it, but it was locked. He tried to lift it, but it wouldn't budge. He pulled on the little keyhole with his fingernail. It was solid shut. He looked at his pocket. The notebook was still there. He pulled it out. The cover was warm, like it had been sitting near a fire. He opened it to the first page again. The handwriting was still there, sharp and jagged, but underneath the first sentence, something new had appeared. Ink that was still wet glistened in the moonlight. "I saw you at the diner." "Don't trust the girl." Leo dropped the notebook. It hit the floor with a heavy thud. He backed away, his breath coming in short gasps. He looked at the window, then at the door, then back at the book lying on the floorboards. He was alone in the house. He had to be. But the silence in the room felt heavy, like someone was holding their breath, waiting to see what he would do next. He realized, with a sudden, sinking feeling, that this wasn't just a renovation project anymore. He had walked into something that he didn't understand, and the house wasn't going to let him leave until he figured and light was fading fast, turning the sky into a deep, bruised purple. I pulled my jacket tighter around my chest, but it didn't help much. The cold here had a way of getting right through to your bones, like it was alive and trying to freeze you from the inside out. I stood there for a moment just listening. The woods were quiet, but not the peaceful kind of quiet. It was the kind that feels like someone is holding their breath, waiting for you to make a mistake. I knew I couldn't stay in one spot. Standing still meant letting the cold win, and I wasn't ready to give up yet. I looked around, trying to find any sign of a path, a road, or even a broken branch that looked like it had been stepped on by another human being recently. But everything looked the same. Just endless trees, tall and skinny, standing like skeletons against the darkening horizon. The ground was covered in a thick layer of old leaves that crunched loudly every time I took a step. It felt like I was announcing my presence to the entire forest, and honestly, that was the last thing I wanted to do. I started walking again, forcing my legs to move even though they felt heavy and tired. Every step was a battle. My mind started playing tricks on me after a while. Shadows in the corners of my eyes looked like people standing behind trees, but when I turned my head, they were just bushes. The wind picked up, whistling through the branches, sounding almost like a whisper. It was eerie, and a shiver ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. I kept thinking about how simple my day was supposed to be. Just a quick walk, a bit of fresh air, and then back home for a hot drink. I never imagined I would be out here, completely lost, as the sun was saying goodbye for the day. It's funny how fast things can change. One minute you feel safe, and the next, you realize how small you really are compared to the vastness of nature. About 20 minutes later, I saw something ahead that made me stop dead in my tracks. It wasn't an animal or a person. It was a structure of some kind. As I got closer, squinting my eyes to see through the dim light, I realized it was an old cabin. It looked like it hadn't been lived in for decades. The wood was gray and rotting, and the roof was caving in on one side. The windows were dark, like hollow eyes staring back at me. Normally, I would have turned around. An abandoned cabin in the middle of the woods is the stuff of horror movies, right? But the temperature was dropping quickly, and the wind was cutting through my clothes like a knife. I was shivering so hard my teeth were chattering. I didn't have much of a choice. It was either freeze outside or take my chances with the creepy cabin. I walked up the cracked stone steps slowly, listening to the groan of the wood under my feet. The door was hanging slightly ajar, swinging gently in the breeze. I pushed it open with a shaking hand, bracing myself for anything. But inside it was just empty and dusty. The air smelled of wet earth and old, rotting wood, but it was noticeably warmer than outside. That was enough for me. I stepped inside and closed the door as best as I could, jamming a piece of broken wood against it to keep it shut. It didn't offer much security, but it made me feel a little bit better. The room was small. There was a stone fireplace on one wall, cold and filled with ash. In the corner, there was a rusted metal bed frame with a moldy mattress on it. I decided I'd rather sit on the floor than touch that mattress. I sat down with my back against the wall, pulling my knees to my chest to conserve heat. For a long time, I just sat there in the dark, listening to the wind howling outside. It felt lonely, but in a strange way, it was also peaceful. The panic that had been rising in my chest all afternoon started to settle down. I was lost, yes. I was cold, definitely. But for right now, I was out of the wind. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I started looking around the room more carefully. On a small table near the window, there was a layer of thick dust. I walked over and wiped some of it away with my sleeve. Underneath, there were scratches on the wood. They looked like tally marks, groups of 5 lines scratched deep into the surface. I ran my fingers over them. It sent a chill through me again. Someone had been here. Someone had been counting something. Days, meals, I don't know, and I didn't really want to know. It was a reminder that I wasn't the first person to get stuck in these woods, and hopefully I wouldn't be the last to leave them either. Then I noticed something else. Near the fireplace, there was a small metal box. It was hidden under a pile of old newspapers that had crumbled into dust. I carefully pulled the box out. It was heavy, like it was made of iron. There was no lock, just a rusty latch. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to leave it alone, Whatever was inside belonged to the past, and maybe the past should stay buried. But curiosity is a powerful thing, especially when you're alone in a dark cabin and your brain is desperate for a distraction. I flipped the latch. It made a sharp asterisk click asterisk sound that echoed in the silent room. I lifted the lid. Inside, there wasn't gold or money. There was just a stack of papers, bound together with a rubber band that had long since turned brittle and snapped. I carefully took them out. The top page was handwritten. The ink had faded to a light brown, but it was still readable. I held the paper up to the moonlight coming through the window. It was a diary entry. The date at the top was from over 40 years ago. I started reading. The writer talked about the woods just like I was experiencing. They talked about the silence and the feeling of being watched. But then, the last sentence made my blood run cold. "It isn't the dark you need to worry about," the page read. "It's what lives in the dark, and I think I just heard it scratching at the door." I dropped the paper as if it had burned me. The silence in the cabin suddenly felt very heavy. I looked at the door, the same door I had jammed shut with a piece of wood. It was still closed. Everything was still. I told myself I was being silly. It was just an old scary story written by someone who was probably just as scared as I was right now. Fear makes people imagine things. But then, I heard it. It was faint at first, almost indistinguishable from the wind outside. A soft, rhythmic scratching sound. Scritch, scritch, scratch. It was coming from the other side of the door. I froze. I stopped breathing. I stared at the wood, watching it. The scratching stopped for a second, and then it started again, louder this time. Thump, thump, scrape. Whatever was out there wasn't the wind. The wind doesn't scratch. It doesn't thump against the wood like it's testing the strength of the lock. My heart started hammering against my ribs so hard it hurt. I grabbed the heavy iron box, thinking maybe I could use it as a weapon if I had to. I felt ridiculous holding a rusty box, but it was better than nothing. The noises outside changed. The scratching turned into a low growl, deep and guttural. It didn't sound like a dog or a bear I had ever heard. It sounded like something old and angry. I backed away from the door, retreating to the far corner of the cabin near the fireplace. I crouched down, making myself as small as possible. I looked around desperately for another exit, but there wasn't one. The window was too small and too high up to reach. The door was the only way in or out, and something was trying very hard to get in. Suddenly, the banging stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. It was waiting. It knew I was in here. I closed my eyes and tried to control my breathing, listening so hard my ears were ringing. Creak. The floorboard right outside the door groaned. Something heavy was stepping onto the porch. Slowly, very slowly, the handle began to turn. The piece of wood I had jammed against it held for a moment, groaning under the pressure. Then with a loud snap, the wood splintered. The door pushed open an inch. I could see nothing but pure blackness through the gap. Then a pair of eyes reflected the moonlight. They weren't glowing red or anything cartoonish like that. They were just pale, wide, and unblinking. And they were looking right at me. I didn't scream. I was too terrified to make a sound. I just gripped the iron box tighter, waiting for the door to fly open and for the nightmare to really begin. But then, a strange thing happened. A siren began to wail in the distance. It was faint far away, but it was definitely a siren. A police car or an ambulance driving on a road somewhere nearby. The eyes at the door blinked. Then just as quickly as they had appeared, they vanished. The heavy weight on the porch seemed to lift. I heard the sound of rustling leaves fading away into the forest, and then nothing. I stayed in that corner for what felt like hours, holding onto that box, waiting for the sun to come up. I didn't sleep. I just watched the door, listening to the silence, wondering what had been standing there, and wondering if it would come back now that the siren was gone. When the first light of dawn finally crept through the window, I knew I couldn't stay here another night. I had to move. I had to find that road before the sun went down. Again, undefined silence in the room was heavier than the dusty books sitting on the shelves. You could almost hear the dust motes floating in the single beam of the flashlight. Nobody wanted to breathe too loud, as if the air itself was listening to us. The young man holding the light tightened his grip on the metal handle until his knuckles turned white. He looked over at his friend, a girl with short, messy hair who was currently trying to wipe sweat off her forehead with the back of her hand. She looked terrified, but there was a spark in her eyes that said she wasn't ready to run away yet. Not after everything they had just found. "We shouldn't stay here too long," she whispered, her voice barely making a sound. "If the floorboards up there started creaking, it means someone is walking around." "We aren't alone in this house." The guy nodded slowly. He knew she was right. The house had been empty for years, or at least that's what the rumors in town said. But houses like this have a way of holding on to secrets, and sometimes those secrets have a heartbeat. He aimed the light at the wooden trapdoor they had just uncovered in the floor of the attic. It was small, barely big enough for a person to slide through, and it was locked with a rusted iron latch that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. "I know," he whispered back, crouching down to get a better look at the lock. "But we came all the way up here. We found the map. We found the loose floorboard. We can't just stop now." "What if this is it? What if this is where the answers are?" The girl sighed, a shaky sound that echoed slightly in the empty space. She sat cross-legged on the dusty floorboards, keeping her eyes fixed on the attic door they had come through. "Fine, but hurry up. That noise wasn't the wind." "The wind doesn't sound like heavy boots dragging across carpet." He turned his attention back to the trapdoor. The rust on the latch was thick and flaky. He pulled out a multi-tool from his pocket, flipping out the small screwdriver. He started to scrape away the red and orange flakes, trying to see if the mechanism underneath was still movable. It was delicate work. If he forced it, it might break and they would never get it open. If he took too long, the footsteps upstairs might get closer. As he worked, the atmosphere in the attic seemed to thicken. It felt like the temperature dropped a few degrees. The girl hugged her arms around herself, rubbing her hands up and down her sleeves to create warmth. She hated this. She loved a good mystery, sure, but she hated feeling like prey. Every shadow in the corner of the room looked like it was moving. The old stuffed chair in the corner looked like a person hunched over, waiting. "Got it," the guy said suddenly. A sharp asterisk click echoed through the room. The girl jumped, letting out a small squeak that she immediately covered with her hand. The guy looked up at her and offered a weak, apologetic smile. "Sorry," he mouthed. He reached forward and placed his fingers under the iron ring of the trapdoor. It was cold to the touch, shockingly cold, like touching a block of ice. He hesitated for just a second. In movies, this was always the moment where something scary jumped out. But this wasn't a movie. This was a dusty, smelly attic in an abandoned house on the edge of town. He took a deep breath and pulled. The wood groaned in protest. It was heavy, much heavier than it looked. He had to brace his foot against the floor, using his leg muscles to help his arms. Slowly, inch by inch, the door lifted. A smell drifted out of the opening. It wasn't the smell of rot or death, which was a relief. It smelled like dry paper, old leather, and something sweet, like vanilla or dried lavender. The girl crawled over to his side, her fear momentarily replaced by curiosity. She leaned over the hole, shining her own light down into the darkness. "What do you see?" she asked. "Shelves," he replied, his voice filled with wonder. "It's a hidden compartment. There are boxes down there." Without waiting for her to tell him to be careful, he swung his legs into the hole and lowered himself down. He dropped a few feet and landed with a soft thud on what felt like a dirt floor. He looked around. It was a narrow space, a crawl space really, that ran underneath the eaves of the house. On either side of him were wooden shelves built into the foundation, and they were packed full of things. "Pass me the light," he called up softly. She handed the heavy flashlight down to him. He swept the beam across the shelves. There were stacks of newspapers tied with twine, bundles of letters held together by rubber bands that had long since turned brittle and broken, and rows of glass jars containing faded, dried herbs. It looked like someone had packed their entire life into this small, secret space and then just walked away. "Find anything good?" the girl called down from above. Her voice sounded anxious again. The creaking from the floor below had stopped, which somehow made it worse. It meant whoever was walking around had stopped to listen. "It's weird," he said, picking up one of the bundles of letters. "It looks like a collection. Look at these dates. Some of these are from 50 years ago." He carefully untied the twine on one bundle. The paper felt fragile, like dry leaves. He shone the light on the top letter. The handwriting was neat, precise, done with a fountain pen. He started to read the first few lines silently. "I can't keep doing this. The shadows are getting longer, and I know they are watching me. If anyone finds this, know that I didn't have a choice." I had to hide the evidence where they would never look. The guy felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold air. He quickly folded the letter and stuffed it into his jacket pocket. "We need to take this stuff," he said, his voice urgent. "Grab a box, anything that looks important." "We need to get out of here." The girl didn't argue. She lowered herself down into the hole, landing beside him. She grabbed a small wooden box that was sitting on the top shelf. It was heavier than she expected. She lifted the lid and her eyes went wide. Inside the box wasn't paper or herbs, it was money. Old bills wrapped in plastic, but money nonetheless. There had to be thousands of dollars in there. "Whoa," she breathed. "This isn't just a diary, is it? Someone hid a fortune here. And they didn't want anyone to find it," the guy added, grabbing a jar that looked different from the others. Inside this jar wasn't herbs, but a heavy silver key. "Put the money in your bag, let's go now." The urgency in his voice was contagious. They could both feel it. The house felt angry. The silence in the attic above them had changed. It wasn't empty anymore. It was pressurized like the air before a thunderstorm. They scrambled back toward the rope they had used to lower themselves, or at least, the spot where they thought the rope was. But in their haste, the guy's foot kicked against one of the support beams under the floorboards. Thud. The sound was loud, shockingly loud in the quiet house. Above them in the attic, they heard a sudden, sharp sound. It was the sound of the attic door being kicked open. Heavy footsteps thundered across the floorboards directly above their heads. Dust rained down on them from the cracks in the wood. "They're up there," the girl whispered, her eyes wide with panic. The guy grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the far end of the crawl space. There was a small, circular window covered in grime and cobwebs that looked out onto the side of the house. It was high up, but it was a way out. "Come on," he hissed. They scrambled over the dirt, knocking over jars and boxes in their path. The noise above them stopped. Whoever it was, they were standing right over the trapdoor. Then came the sound of the latch being lifted. The trapdoor flew open with a crash. A beam of light from the attic sliced through the darkness of the crawl space, blinding them for a second. "Hey," a deep, angry voice boomed from above. "Who is down there?" The guy didn't look back. He reached the window and used the heavy glass jar he was holding to smash the glass. It shattered outward, letting in the cool night air. He used his jacket to clear away the remaining shards. "You first," he told the girl, cupping his hands together to give her a boost. She didn't hesitate. She put her foot in his hands and scrambled through the window, tumbling onto the grass outside. The guy was right behind her. He threw one leg over the sill, but a hand reached down from the opening above and grabbed his ankle. It was a strong grip, rough and calloused. "Oh no, you don't," the voice growled. The guy kicked out wildly, his shoe connecting with something solid. There was a grunt of pain, and the hand let go. He hurled himself the rest of the way through the window, rolling onto the damp lawn beside his friend. "Run!" he shouted, scrambling to his feet. They didn't look back at the old house. They didn't stop to see if anyone was climbing out the window after them. They just ran. They ran through the overgrown garden, tripping over roots and brambles. They ran until their lungs burned, and their legs felt like jelly. They ran all the way to the edge of the property, where the old fence met the road, only stopping when they reached the safety of the streetlights. They collapsed against a rusty stop sign, gasping for air, their hearts hammering against their ribs like trapped birds. The girl clutched her bag tight against her chest. The guy reached into his pocket and pulled out the old letter and the heavy silver key. The house loomed behind them in the darkness, silent and still again. But they knew it wasn't empty. They knew they had woken something up. "We did it," the girl wheezed, a nervous laugh escaping her lips. "We actually did it." The guy looked at the key in his hand, glinting under the orange streetlight. "Yeah," he said, his mind racing. "But what did we just steal?" "And who was that guy?" He looked back at the dark windows of the house. For a second, just a split second, he thought he saw a curtain move in the attic window. They weren't safe yet, not even close. But as he looked at the fear and excitement in his friend's eyes, he knew one thing for sure. This was just the beginning. They had found the secret, but now they had to figure out what it meant before the house, or the person inside it, caught up with them. Undefined, rusty metal door loomed in front of them, looking taller and more threatening than it had from a distance. Tom wiped his sweaty palms on his jeans, trying to hide the fact that his hands were shaking. He glanced over at Leo, who was shifting his weight from one foot to the other, looking back at the empty playground as if he expected someone to jump out of the bushes. "We don't have to do this," Leo said quietly. He kicked a small rock near his feet. "It looks like rain anyway. My mom will kill me if I ruin another pair of shoes." Tom shook his head. He held up the old brass key he had found inside the hollow of the oak tree 3 days ago. It felt cold in his hand, heavy with possibility. "No, we're already here. We came all this way." If the map on the back of this photo is right, whatever we're looking for is right behind this door. "Do you really want to go back to just playing video games and wondering, what if?" Leo sighed, a long, dramatic sound that showed he wasn't happy about it, but he stepped closer. "Fine. But if we get caught trespassing, I'm blaming you. Just help me with this lock." The lock was covered in green moss and looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. Tom pushed the key in, expecting it to stick or break. To his surprise, it slid in smooth as butter. There was a sharp, metallic asterisk click that echoed in the quiet evening air. Both boys froze, looking toward the main school building in the distance to make sure no security guard had heard. When no lights came on, Tom took a deep breath and turned the key. The door groaned loudly as he pushed it. It was a terrible, screeching sound, like metal crying out against metal. Tom cringed, waiting for a yell. But the only response was the wind picking up in the trees nearby, rustling the leaves. The smell hit them first. It wasn't a bad smell exactly, but it was the smell of time passing. It smelled like old paper, damp earth, and dry wood. It was a thick, dusty smell that made you feel like you were stepping into a different world, separate from the rest of the town. Tom stepped inside, holding his phone up to light the way. The beam of light cut through the thick dust floating in the air, looking like tiny stars. Leo followed close behind, pulling the heavy door shut to keep the wind out. The darkness wrapped around them, instantly making the space feel smaller and more secret. Inside, the shed was bigger than it looked from the outside. Along the walls were shelves filled with broken toys, old sports equipment, and boxes that were falling apart. In the center of the room, covered by a large gray tarp, was something large and square. "Whoa," Leo whispered, his voice bouncing off the walls. "What is that?" "I don't know," Tom said. He walked slowly toward the tarp, his feet making crunching sounds on the dirt floor. "Do you think it's safe?" "It's just a shed, Tom," Leo said, though he didn't sound very confident. "It's not a dungeon, just lift the sheet." Tom reached out. His fingers were trembling slightly. He grabbed the corner of the heavy canvas tarp. He took a deep breath and pulled. A cloud of dust flew up into the air, making both of them cough and wave their hands in front of their faces. As the dust settled, the light from the phone revealed what was underneath. It was an old desk, a beautiful, heavy wooden desk with carvings on the legs. It looked like something a principal would have used 50 years ago. But it wasn't just a desk sitting there abandoned. On top of the desk, everything was arranged perfectly neat. There was a single stack of black notebooks. The corners were worn soft from use, and next to them sat a small, silver radio. Leo walked around the side of the desk, shining his light on the object. Is that a ham radio?" "I think so," Tom said. He picked up one of the notebooks. It felt surprisingly fragile. He opened the first page carefully. The handwriting was neat, small, and written in blue ink that had faded to a light purple. It was dated. "June 4th, 1982. "Open it," Leo urged, leaning over his shoulder, his eyes wide with curiosity. "What does it say?" Tom cleared his throat and read aloud. "Today, I finally finished the repairs on the machine. The signal is stronger than I thought it would be. I can hear voices coming from the static, but they aren't speaking English. Or at least, I don't think they are. I have to find a way to tune it better before anyone finds out. I think they are trying to tell us something important." Tom looked up at Leo. The silence in the shed suddenly felt very heavy. "Okay, that is actually creepy," Leo said, lowering his voice. "Who wrote this?" Tom flipped to the front cover. There was no name, just a small symbol drawn in silver pen. It looked like a star with a circle around it. "I don't know. But look at this date." He flipped a few pages forward, the paper crinkling softly. "This goes on for years, 1983, 1985, 1990. This person spent their whole life working on this." "Keep reading the last entry," Leo said. He picked up the silver radio and turned it over in his hands. It was cold and heavy, with dials that looked delicate. Tom flipped to the very last page of the book. His heart was beating faster now. This was the kind of adventure you read about in storybooks, not something that happened on a Tuesday afternoon in a boring town. He found the final entry. It was dated only 2 years ago. I'm getting too old to keep coming here. The noise from the radio is getting louder. I think they know I'm listening. I'm leaving the books and the radio here. If anyone finds this, be careful. Don't turn the dial past the number 5. Whatever you do, don't go past 5. You aren't ready for what comes next. Tom snapped the book shut. The warning echoed in his mind. Don't go past 5? Leo asked. He looked down at the radio in his hands. There was a large dial on the front. The numbers went from 1 to 10. It was currently sitting on 0. Put it down, Leo, Tom said. His voice sounded strange, tight, and serious. Just a little bit, Leo said. A small smile played on his lips. He always loved scary stuff. He was the one who always wanted to watch the horror movies that Tom hated. I just want to see if it works. It's probably broken anyway. It's like 30 years old. Leo, seriously. The note said, It's just an old radio, Tom. Relax. What's the worst that could happen? We hear some baseball game from 1990. Leo reached out and turned the knob. A soft asterisk pop asterisk sound came from the speaker, followed by a low hum of static. The sound filled the small shed. It buzzed in their ears. Leo turned it to 2, just static. He turned it to 3. Still nothing but white noise. See, Leo laughed, the tension breaking a little. Nothing, it's just junk. He turned it to 4, the static changed. It wasn't just white noise anymore. There was a rhythmic sound underneath it. Thump, thump, thump. It sounded like a heartbeat or maybe heavy footsteps walking on a metal floor. Tom grabbed Leo's arm. Okay, that's enough. Turn it off. Wait, listen, Leo said, pulling his arm away gently, his eyes glued to the machine. Do you hear that? Under the heavy thumping, there was a voice. It was faint, crackling like dry leaves, but it was definitely a voice. It wasn't speaking English. It sounded fast and high-pitched, chattering away. Then, suddenly, the voice stopped. The static went quiet. For a second, there was complete silence in the shed. The air felt charged, like the moment before a lightning strike. Did it break? Leo asked. He tapped the side of the radio. Then a new voice came through the speaker. It was loud and clear. It sounded like a man, and he was speaking English. Can you hear me? The voice asked. Tom and Leo looked at each other. Neither of them moved, neither of them breathed. I know you are there, asterisk, the voice continued. You opened the door, you found the books. I have been waiting a long time for someone to find that frequency. Leo let go of the radio. It hit the desk with a loud asterisk clatter and then fell to the floor. The voice kept coming from the speaker on the floor, calm and steady. Don't run, I just want to talk, I need help with something important. Only you can do it. Tom grabbed Leo's shoulder. We have to go now. They didn't wait to hear anything else. They didn't care about the notebooks or the mystery anymore. Fear took over. They turned and ran for the door. Tom shoved it open, the rusty hinges screaming again. They burst out into the cool evening air, their lungs burning. They didn't stop running until they reached the edge of the playground, near the orange glow of the streetlights. They collapsed onto a wooden bench, gasping for breath. Tom looked back at the shed. It looked dark and silent in the distance. It looked like just a normal, broken-down building again. Did that really happen? Leo asked between breaths. He was holding his side, his face pale. Was that real? Tom looked down at his hands. He realized he was still clutching the black notebook. He had forgotten to put it back. He looked at the cover, the silver star shining in the streetlight. Yeah, Tom said quietly, his heart still hammering against his ribs. It happened. He opened the book again, his fingers fumbling with the pages. He flipped through until he found the last page, the one with the warning. But right now, he wasn't looking at the warning. He was looking at the bottom of the page. There, written in a different ink, fresh, wet, and black, were words that hadn't been there 2 minutes ago. The handwriting looked exactly like the message they just heard on the radio. It read, "See you tomorrow at the same time." Don't be late. Tom slammed the book shut and looked at Leo, a mix of terror and thrill rushing through him. What is it? Leo asked, looking terrified. What does it say? Tom stood up slowly. The fear was starting to turn into something else. Excitement, curiosity, a feeling that this boring town wasn't so boring anymore and that their lives had just changed forever. I think, Tom said, clutching the book tight to his chest, we just got ourselves undefined. Air was getting colder as the night went on. and I could see my breath puffing out in little white clouds every time I exhaled. It was the kind of cold that sticks to your bones, no matter how many layers you are wearing. We had been walking for hours, or at least it felt like hours. My watch had stopped working a while ago, so I honestly had no idea what time it was. It could have been midnight, or it could have been 3 in the morning. All I knew was that my legs were burning, and every step felt heavier than the last one. Ahead of me, Jamie stopped walking. She shone her flashlight beam down at the ground, signaling for me to pause. I came up right behind her, trying to catch my breath without making too much noise. The forest around us was incredibly quiet. Usually you hear crickets or an owl hooting or the wind rustling the leaves, but tonight it was just dead silent. It felt like the whole world was holding its breath, waiting to see what we would do next. "What do you think?" Jamie whispered, barely moving her lips. She pointed the light toward a cluster of thick bushes that looked exactly like every other cluster of bushes we had passed for the last mile. I squinted into the darkness. "I think we are lost," I whispered back. "I think we have been walking in circles for the last 2 hours, and that rock over there looks really familiar." Jamie shook her head. "No, look closer. Behind the bushes, do you see that gap?" I looked where she was pointing. At first, I didn't see anything. It just looked like a wall of green and darkness. But then I blinked a few times and focused. There was a small space between the bushes, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. And inside that gap, it wasn't just more forest. It looked like something made of stone. My heart skipped a beat. Is that a wall?" "I think it's the entrance," Jamie said. There was a thrill in her voice that I hadn't heard all night. She was tired, I knew that, but the excitement of finding something new was giving her a second wind. "The map said the old station was hidden behind the ridge. We have to check it out." I hesitated. Part of me wanted to turn around and go back to the car. It was safe there. It was warm. But the other part of me, the part that had dragged me out of bed at midnight for this adventure, was screaming to go forward. I nodded, and Jamie started carefully moving the branches aside. We squeezed through the bushes one by one. The thorns caught on my jacket, tugging at the fabric, but I pushed through until I was standing on the other side. The silence here was different. It wasn't the empty silence of the forest. It was the heavy silence of a place that hadn't been visited in decades. We were standing in front of a large, wooden door set into a stone frame. The wood was gray and rotting, covered in moss that looked like green velvet. Vines were growing all over it, trying to pull the door back into the earth. "Wow," I breathed out. "You actually found it," Jamie grinned, her face lighting up in the reflected glow of her flashlight. I told you. I told you the coordinates were right." She stepped forward and grabbed the rusty iron handle. She turned it, and we both heard a loud, screeching metal sound that echoed through the trees. I flinched, looking around to make sure we hadn't alerted anyone, but we were still alone. "It's stuck," she grunted, putting her shoulder against the wood. She pushed with all her might, her boots slipping in the damp mud. "Help me out." I stepped up and put my hands on the door next to hers. "On 3, I said. 1, 2, 3, we pushed together. For a second, nothing happened. The door felt like it was cemented shut. But then there was a sudden crack, like the sound of a dry branch snapping. The door popped open an inch, sending a cloud of dust into our faces. We coughed and waved our hands, pushing harder until the gap was wide enough for us to slip through. The air inside smelled like old paper, wet dirt, and something else that I couldn't quite place, maybe like old metal or paint. It wasn't a bad smell, just old. Like a library that had been closed for 100 years. We stepped inside, and Jamie swept her flashlight beam across the room. It was bigger than I expected. There were rows of old wooden shelves lining the walls, but most of them were empty. In the center of the room, there was a large table that was covered in notebooks and tools that looked like they belonged in a museum. "Do you think this is where they kept the supplies?" I asked, running my finger along the dusty table. It left a clean streak in the gray dirt. "Maybe," Jamie said, wandering over to a corner of the room. "Or maybe it was their office. Look at this." She was standing in front of a large safe that was built into the wall. It was about the size of a refrigerator, with a big round dial on the front. The paint was chipping off, revealing the steel underneath. It looked incredibly heavy and completely out of place in this rotting wooden shed. "Is it open?" I asked, walking over to her. Jamie tried the handle. It was locked tight. No luck. But look at the floor. I looked down. Around the base of the safe, the floorboards were scratched up, like someone had tried to pry it open. There were even marks on the metal where it looked like someone had taken a chisel or a crowbar to it. People tried to get in, I said, feeling a strange chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. A long time ago. They didn't succeed, though, Jamie said, tapping the front of the safe. Whatever is in here, it's still here. I walked away from the safe and continued exploring the room. There was something fascinating about being the first people to see this in who knows how long. It felt like stepping into a time capsule. I picked up a notebook from the table. The pages were yellow and brittle, and the ink had faded to a light brown, but I could still read the handwriting. It was neat, precise writing, lists of numbers, dates, and what looked like names. "Hey, Jamie," I called out softly, "you should see this." She came over, leaving the safe behind for a moment. "What is it?" "It's a logbook," I said, carefully turning the pages. "Dates from 50 years ago. Look at this entry. It says, Project Nightingale complete. Moved to Sector 4. Nightingale?" Jamie asked, her brow furrowing. "I've never heard of that in the stories." "Me neither," I replied. "And look here, the last entry. It's dated just a few days before the place was supposedly abandoned." I cleared my throat and read the words out loud. "They are watching the perimeter. We can't leave yet. We have to hide the evidence. If anyone finds this, burn it." Jamie looked at the book, then back at the safe. "Do you think whatever is in that safe is the evidence they were talking about?" "Maybe," I said. I felt a sudden urge to be careful. We were just two people looking for an adventure, but this felt real. These were real people who had been scared, scared enough to lock things away and write warnings in a book. "We need to get that safe open," Jamie said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "How?" I asked. "It's steel, we don't have dynamite, we don't even have a good hammer." Jamie looked around the room. Her flashlight landed on a heavy crowbar that was hanging on the wall, covered in cobwebs. A smile slowly spread across her face. "Maybe we don't need to crack the code," she said, walking over and grabbing the tool. She pulled the cobwebs off and tested the weight in her hand. "Maybe we just need a little leverage." I looked at the old door, then back at the safe. "We have to be quiet. If this thing is loud, it'll carry through the woods." "We'll be gentle," she promised. She walked back to the safe and wedged the tip of the crowbar into the gap between the door and the frame. She took a deep breath, braced her foot against the wall, and pulled. At first, nothing happened. The veins in her neck popped out as she strained against the metal. I winced, waiting for the loud screech of tearing metal, but it was surprisingly quiet. Just a low groan from the steel. "It's moving," she grunted. "Give me a hand." I stepped in and put my hands on the crowbar next to hers. Together, we pulled. The metal groaned again, louder this time. It felt like we were fighting a giant beast. I squeezed my eyes shut and pulled with everything I had left. My back hurt, my hands were slipping, but I didn't let go. With a sudden, sharp ping asterisk, something snapped inside the locking mechanism. The door of the safe swung open a few inches, hitting the wall with a dull thud. We both froze, holding our breath. We listened to the silence outside. No birds flew away, no sirens wailed. We were safe. Jamie slowly pushed the door the rest of the way open. We both leaned in, shining our flashlights into the dark interior. I expected to see gold or money or stacks of diamonds. That's what you always think you'll find in a safe, right? But this safe wasn't full of treasure. It was full of files. Hundreds of manila folders stacked neatly from the bottom to the top. On the spine of each folder, there was a single word written in that same neat, precise handwriting. Jamie reached in and pulled one out. She opened it up.